We're live. You can chat to me if you don't want to say it on there, but we'll get going on Instagram as well. I believe I did it right. Yeah, there we go. Cool. All right, so here we are. Hannah Barnett, how are you today?
Good. How are you doing today, Joe?
Lovely. So we're here today to talk about some new research, and you're a researcher over at Imperial College London. Um, First time on any of our shows, so I'm excited to have you and learn about your work.
First and hopefully not the last. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess first off, your London accent isn't super strong. I
It's
assume you're not from London.
no, I'm from the States as well. Assuming you're also from the States and not, I did not make a Canadian very offended right there. I'm from Washington, D.C., but I've been in the UK for a little bit more than like 2.5 years now.
Great, great. And you moved over there to do work at Imperial.
I moved over there to get my anthropology degree, medical
Mm.
anthropology, specifically my
Hmm.
master's at the University of Edinburgh. So I had spent a few years in Scotland, then moved down at the end of January to London.
Lucky, the new Athens. That's great. Someday I'll get to visit Edinburgh. So, I guess let's dig in. What is this latest research project you're working on?
So this research project has been in development and kind of budded into fruition from my co-author Balazs Chigetti's his beautiful mind. He's done a lot of great work at Imperial and had this idea one day about the fact that there isn't a lot of knowledge out there about people who facilitate psychedelic experiences and what they're doing, because basically the regulatory landscape has shrouded everything in mystery because people don't feel comfortable coming forward talking about it. So at the end of the day, what we do know about the positive outcomes that are coming out of these clinical trials is exactly that. It's coming from these clinical trials, and it's really put a bit of a blanket over the landscape of practices that are happening, but also how these outcomes might be replicated in real life psychedelic facilitated settings once those, in a couple of years, as the industry, as the regulatory landscape changes. So so he had this idea to create a survey that would be disseminated to former and current psychedelic practitioners, just to assess their training, their background, their spaces, which hopefully, aims to get a better sense of the landscape. Um,
Yeah. So it's definitely the case. There's so much of a shroud over what's happening in the underground, and they've been
mhm.
so active for so long. And you're right. Like this is potentially a treasure trove of helpful stuff.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, for the first part, it's that, like, compared to clinical trials, it's the great grandfather and the newborn baby. The clinical trials they're in their relative infancy. And I think that one of the biggest needs for this survey is the fact that researchers in clinical settings need to be able to more acutely reflect upon their own like clinical methodologies and to inform future trials. I mean, a lot of the therapeutic approaches used in clinical trials nowadays are varied greatly, and some very established researchers in the methodologies just say they use psychedelic psychotherapy, and that's their method of psychotherapeutic approach, when in reality the schools of psychotherapy are very broad, and it's such an important part of the psychedelic experience that I think having a more reflective practice in the clinical setting that could draw from these findings and practices that have been developed and tailored over decades and decades would seek the psychedelic research field very well.
Hmm, that's brilliant. There's this. You just reminded me of this video I watched ages ago of who was it? It was like Carl Rogers, Abe Maslow, and like a third major psychotherapist, psychiatrist type. And the idea was like who was the best.
Yeah.
And it was like whoever they had the most positive regard towards, like the patient. Facilitator was
Yeah,
like
we
the
love
actual
that
result.
therapeutic alliance. We love that therapeutic alliance, right?
Yeah. Um, Absolutely, absolutely, and that's so key. And in my breathwork experience, we're always trying to make people as comfortable as possible, and
Mhm. But there is
that's
like,
hard.
yeah, there is a and power imbalances, and we could go into
Hmm.
that avenue for another conversation. But
Hmm.
it definitely needs to be a little bit more refined, especially when we think about the outcomes that are coming out of these clinical trials. The importance of set and setting means that we need to have such an eye on the different kind of approaches, um, not just therapeutic approaches, but everything used in these clinical trials, especially when we think about what's actually happening in real life settings and understanding variations in treatment outcomes.
Hmm. Absolutely. So, are you bringing a very particular medical anthropology lens to this study?
I like to think, because Balash, the co-author, he is a statistician, mathematician by background. I don't touch that stuff, and so I like to think we're kind of balancing each other out. I think for me, like I've always been very, very interested in understanding um, how this therapeutic approach is being defined and ascribed to different definitions. Um, across settings. And so that's kind of what I hope to get out of it too, because I mean, what we had just discussed recently is the fact that originally our survey was called it was targeted to psychedelic assisted therapists and it was framed in psychedelic assisted therapy. But in reality, what we really are doing is opening up the survey to all psychedelic facilitators, not only those who are licensed or trained as therapists, just because really, we understand, as I said, that real life guided psychedelic use doesn't often ascribe to the same medical and social parameters as Western schools of psychotherapy, especially those that have developed over the last few decades. But that doesn't invalidate the application or the prevalence of it in the real world. But in fact, they often encompass like broader aspects of well-being, spirituality, creativity, ceremonial. That I think for me, from the medical anthropology background, understanding those holistic approaches can also give a lot of insight to the clinical approach to give a more comprehensive understanding of the potential benefits and risks of psychedelics.
Hmm.
Just take
Absolutely.
Oregon, for example, like Oregon and Colorado soon, as I'm sure you're very much aware, they very delicately authorize psilocybin services, not therapy. And, you're actually not really allowed to call yourself a therapist if you go through accredited training in Oregon. Um, and, when in the bill, they do list the typical DSM-5 condition types as one of the benefits of psilocybin therapy, but then they also mention the spiritual being, which going back to medical anthropology, I believe really speaks to the fact that like what individuals consider therapeutic is culturally and socially defined.
I love that. And yeah, Oregon very explicitly, when people voted on it, it was a very non-clinical frame. Um,
Hmm.
the current Colorado situation is also very much non-clinical, though I think my understanding is that there will be a frame in which therapists will be able to offer psilocybin psychotherapy and have their licenses protected by the state. That said,
Hmm.
prescribers would be putting their DEA license to prescribe at risk if they participated in that way as prescribers or therapists. So they would more likely have to say this person is healthy enough for psilocybin. Like that would kind of be the thing versus
Oh, really?
here's a prescription. It's going to be super interesting. The whole thing is fascinating how it's playing out. Um, but yeah,
So
they
there's
did carve out
prescribers in the model in Colorado.
ish, ish. Not exactly. It's more like an endorsement. Um,
Okay.
and
And is it
and
that like a gatekeeping mechanism?
a little bit. So in the decrim frame, there's it's effectively legalization without calling it legalization because there's no real rules or regs other than you cannot sell mushrooms to people, or DMT,
Yeah.
ibogaine, mescaline.
Yeah.
Um, but you can sell services around it of any kind.
Hmm.
Um, but
Hmm.
license boards could still take your license, or you could theoretically get in trouble for practicing medicine without a license if you're acting like a doctor and not a doctor, for instance.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of interesting stuff going on there, and it's all going to play out at an accelerating pace over the next year.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I do think it's really interesting the different levels of, the guided supervisor versus the clinical supervisor and how you have to be only attached to one center in Colorado in order to be established and accredited in the eyes of the state. Especially when you think about crossover with Oregon, if you're going to have a lot of people who, hopefully, if they got accredited in Oregon, are able to use their, provide services in Colorado and vice versa. But yeah, it does sound similar to what the regulation was in Oregon, but it is interesting, that gatekeeping aspect as well.
Which is, pluses and minuses, and then I think, going to
Yeah,
continue to allow a legal frame around religious stuff, which is going to be interesting to see how they work that out. I have no idea how,
yeah.
but they'll try.
I think in the form of legacy healers, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it sounds like you've done more reading than me. But so, huh. All right. So often this movement is riding on the back of people who have been breaking the law for decades in pretty serious ways that can put them in jail for decades. Um,
Yeah.
and in fact, I personally know people who've been incarcerated for decades, and it's not awesome. So your study is asking people to kind of
Say
volunteer
exactly
information,
that. Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
sure you've thought about this, but like, how are you all thinking about that?
Yeah, I had to make my case in front of the Imperial Ethics Committee, who are a lot scarier than you, actually, which I feel like, if I can handle them, I can handle anyone. But you basically, there is that risk, and I think that's one of the maybe one of the biggest barriers to a higher sample size and a higher response rate, is that people, no matter what we tell them, will still be naturally discouraged from divulging this information. It's why it hasn't come out earlier, and why we only really scratch the surface in this study. But we've done everything we can to make sure it is GDPR compliant, which for the US folk is just making sure that all of the security data protocols and research ethic approvals are set in place and encrypted, all that good stuff. And we're not collecting any personal identifiable information. And we're also asking purely retrospective questions. And so we're not asking them about people's intentions, what they're doing right now, what they plan on doing in the future. We ask them if they've ever done it in the past. Tell us about that.
Hmm.
And we're also not collecting any demographic information that would be able to be traced back to them, even if we have a very low sample size. And
Could
so
people choose to use
there,
a browser like Tor browser or something to anonymize their connection?
it sounds like, if that is the thing, yeah, I've never
Yeah.
heard of that before, but it seems
It's how
like,
you access the dark web. Sorry.
right.
And then there's
I
also
wanted to
like
say that, but if I
VPNs.
was wrong, I'm like, that's really rogue of me. um, Yeah, I mean, theoretically, they wouldn't have to, because we aren't collecting IP addresses. They have no digital or physical trace. But yeah, as I said, either way, there's always going to be that hesitation. And also, if they're uncomfortable with any of the questions, they can exit out the survey without saving their responses.
Hmm.
You have to press submit on the survey and get very deep into the survey before you press submit, before your responses are recorded in our system.
Hmm. I love that. Cool. And yeah, people can protect themselves with browsers like that. They could do it with
Mhm.
VPNs. Like, I think for the science and like understanding this stuff, it's really important that people contribute to research like this. And I really hope people take that opportunity to do so. But, like you say, keep your personal information out of there. Try to keep yourself as anonymous as possible. I assume you're using a platform like Qualtrics.
We're using Alchemer, which is as GDPR compliant as Qualtrics, we like to think. But yeah, we've used Alchemer for all of our Imperial surveys.
Great.
So that's where, yeah, it's pretty robust. But yeah, exactly to your point, I love that you put those options out there for people who do feel still a little bit nervous providing their information on a database like that. But yeah, and I also understand that there is kind of it's good to think of it in a way of, the researchers at Imperial, at these clinical settings, are going to be able to use this information to inform future clinical trials. And I do recognize, while saying that, there is a bit of a clash of cultures that is occurring simultaneously, that maybe people don't feel like they owe their voices or their opinions to help the clinical setting. But I do think that, it could be a unified approach, and it is tremendously helpful for not just clinical settings, but especially the regulatory pathways like Colorado, like Oregon, that are emerging on the back of the momentum, on the back of the movement, that very much, are creating all these different gray areas of legality and use, but are still very much relevant to different subcultures of psychedelic settings. So
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, um, what kind of what kind of pushback? I'm just really curious. Like, I'm like, what were you getting from the ethics group when in those conversations?
basically hitting what you're saying, where one of the
Hmm.
biggest no-nos for any research is having participants risk their, divulge any sensitive information or incriminating information. Um, so that was the main part, was the fact that we are asking people about, even if they do indicate that they are, which is one of the questions, is we ask them what kind of legal setting they work in, which will also correspond to the drug that they indicate that they're working with, because of course you can have legal settings for one drug and for not another. But yeah, I think that the biggest pushback across the board, as I said, would just be the divulging of illegal work and experiences, but as well as the fact that it is an open survey, and with any open survey, you can always have people who just want to just like click answers and submit because they're bored that day. But I think A, we've made it long enough that no one's going to have the time to do that. But B, the best part about recruiting a high sample size is that we will be able to at least still generalize some of the findings that we receive. And also, we have a really smart team of researchers where this study is co-authored with David Arizzo, David Nutt, Robin Carhart Harris, um, Chris Timmerman, Balaj, and I. And I think together we all had a really good sense of answers that might actually not be completely legitimate. So that was one of the other biggest concerns that, as we can tell, I have assuaged them because we're here talking about the survey as it's been approved. So to the other board, but yeah,
That's excellent. How long have you been working on this?
it's been a year and a half of back and forth. Yeah, we had Kyle Greenway was the other. He's the other co-author on the study, and he was a visiting researcher from McGill, who's just really tremendously smart psychiatrist. And it was just originally Kyle, Balash, and I, and then it grew in size and feedback. And we did take an active effort to engage a lot of facilitators in the field. So we reached out and recruited some, I don't want to say underground, because as I said, there are a lot of people who are working in kind of ambiguous gray legal zones. And underground doesn't feel like it does that nuanced justice of a term. But
Right.
I will say we did reach out to people across the board, and they all had a very big voice in providing feedback on the draft and the questions we were asking. And as I said, going back to Blosh and my differing disciplinary backgrounds, there were a lot of conversations about the kind of the different elements to focus on. He wanted to focus on dose. I wanted to focus on non-pharmacological elements naturally. So I like to think that's why it took a year and a half. But in reality, I think, just the nature of academic research is that you have 6 other projects going on too. So
Right, absolutely. The like medical anthropology is obviously super interesting. And I'm wondering, and I hope people get this and why it's interesting. I'm not going to explain it to anybody, but I'm like kind of
explain it
curious
to
if
me.
there's. Well, it's just so interesting. Like, there's so many different approaches to medicine worldwide. There's different like cultures. Do you remember this religious studies guy out of Emory, who is doing a lot of really interesting work about uh, medicine as a type of religion? How it looks very similar to certain religions. What the hell is
I
his
feel
name?
like if you say his name, I'm sure I read him in my math.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
there's a good chance. Medicine as religion. I wish I remembered his name. I think I like Gary maybe, but I'm not 100% on that.
Trust that.
But he's been on the show. He's fascinating, and
Oh, really?
yeah, like there's extra levels here too in the psychedelic space of religiosity. It's not just like medicine as religion. It's like, oh, we're instantiating often very spiritual experiences for people that we don't necessarily have a framework for when we're experiencing these things. And what do we do when we come
Yeah.
back? And there's so many big
Yeah.
questions from like a medicine point of view.
Yeah, and I also think yeah, exactly what you're saying. The suggestibility of the drug in itself is raising a lot of important questions when you think about symbolism in the room in these clinical trials. As we see a lot coming forward, especially, I mean, David Dupuy, he's a fellow anthropologist who is a really does a lot of really great field work with the Shipibo and found, just undertones of different religious iconography that
Hmm.
really not only impacted how people experienced the psychedelic, how people had their psychedelic experience, but actually the phenomenological contents that they saw, based
Hmm.
on the preambles before before the ayahuasca was taken, XYZ. And so the really religiosity, it's not just a historical, interesting read for an anthropology major, but it's actually has like real world implications when you think about some of the suggestibility and the dialogue that is being used across the world in some of these in some psychedelic settings. Yeah.
This guy's name is Gary Latterman. Does that sound familiar at all at Emory?
Gary Letterman.
Ladder, like a climbing thing. Ladder man.
Oh no.
Um,
I
he's
looked him up. His face looks like an anthropologist though, like a anthropologist from California.
yeah, and stuck in Atlanta, which he apparently loves. But it's a really fascinating conversation around psychedelics today. To not have too much of a pun here, and then like if we compare this to like historical things in the European tradition, it almost looks as complex as the alchemical traditions in like kind of Elizabethan times. It's like
Yeah,
a
like
lot of
immortality
transactions.
key kind of. Yeah, yeah.
Ish. I was actually talking about like actual alchemists making whatever it is they're
Oh,
making,
okay. Yeah,
which could be
yeah,
fraud, could be real, could be whatever. But there's a lot of
yeah,
religious undertones in that thing because you can't do it without God. So it's like
yeah.
there are traditions inside psychedelia that have that going on, um, and it's interesting. I had an
It's
interesting reaction from a French, I think he was a psychologist, providing critiques on some of the videos that Hopkins put out. Like, I think there was some video, Bill Richards kind of saying, like, hey, you know, what was it? Showing a woman in session a photo of her husband and saying, like, this is God. And I'm like, that's a little awkward. And we don't have
I
enough
mean, I
context to comment, but I'm also like, ugh, we should ask questions.
yeah, I mean, I wasn't gonna name drop, but I what you said it. So I think that when yeah, I think some of the Hopkins studies with Johnson and Griffiths have recently been had a bit of a light cast to them about maybe some of the leading questions that they were asking also during the research processes. Um, and I think even when you go something as simple as the mystical element, what's it called? I'm blanking on it right now, but like the
MEQ?
mystical, yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Like, I think that it also says a lot about the framing and the way that discourse can kind of confirm or uphold certain ideas of the psychedelic experience. If you're having a psychedelic experience and then you're asked to respond about the mystical, the mysticism of the experience, you're going to naturally think about how it was mystical. And so, kind of seeing how different scientific actors and political actors might be upholding certain elements of the psychedelic experience in the very clinical way that we're measuring it,
Mm-hmm. For sure.
is very
And
interesting.
I think like on one hand it's really interesting to divorce the spiritual and like stay like crazy objective and have the position
Hmm.
from nowhere, which isn't actually a real thing, but it's like it's a
Yeah.
good thing to aim for in some cases. But then like I think there's also room for research on the other side. And I think you're going to get some really interesting data from practitioners in the field to comment on that kind of stuff in your survey.
Yeah, I really do hope so. I mean, I think the next step would be to be able to take, the same. I think in an ideal world, we would have really rich qualitative data. In my ideal world as a social scientist, we would
Hmm.
have really rich qualitative data. Balazs would disagree with me. He wants really great quantitative data. But I do think that even the quantitative, more the discrete questions that we do ask that talks about those non-pharmacological elements that psychedelic facilitators think are important for the experience, such as the music that they play. Does it have an arch? Is it agreed upon with the participant prior to the experience? Do they feel like there needs to be a room full of fuzzy blankets? How are the visuals that are coming to mind when I say this? Do they align with what's happening in clinical trials? Which is, you have your stock photo of someone with a blindfold on, surrounded by two very, very endearing therapists. Um, what are the differences and the similarities there? And I think that's one of the biggest things that we will be able to take away from it as well is yeah, just being able to paint a picture that hasn't really been put to the easel. If I couldn't think of a worse metaphor. So that's it.
That's great. And so anybody who's actively providing these kinds of services is eligible? Are there other categories of people who should be looking at taking this?
Yeah, so basically anyone who has it's a pretty intentionally open-ended eligibility field, but anyone who has previously or is currently conducting psychedelic experiences, and as we said before, therapeutic approaches, spiritual approaches. It's a very loosely defined term, but they just have to be 18 years or older and have a good command of the English language and be in Western settings, because that is really the intention of this survey, is to understand what's going on in the global north and
Hmm.
these yeah, basically where a lot of the clinical trials are taking place and where we see a lot of the regulatory conversations occurring alongside the mainstream movement to psychedelic use. Yeah.
Mm, that's super interesting. Um, so I would like to say we're going to have a link in our kind of landing page. So it's, I think, psychedelicstoday.com/welcome. We'll have a link there. I'm going to hopefully be able to put links in all of our social videos, like this video, wherever that lives. But where else can people follow up on it? Is there a website for the study?
So we don't have a dedicated website for the study, but we do have my email, in which people are welcome to contact me. And I'm sure you will also maybe put I could give you my
Yeah, please
email
share that, and we'll
and
do that.
LinkedIn. And yeah, the landing page to the survey has everything and more about the study that I just discussed today, including the participant information sheet, which can give a little bit more information about it. And also, if people don't feel comfortable, as we said, responding to the survey, but they're really interested in the results of our findings, they can also just feel free to reach out to me and ask to be kept updated with any of our results. So they can stay in the loop. So happy to also do that as well, even if they choose not to participate. But yeah, so I guess another important point is that we will be having the survey stay open for approximately 4 more months, um, in which time we are trying to get as many responses as possible. And so if people who hear about the survey not only take it themselves if they're eligible, but forward onto their networks, I think that, for example, the psychedelic field is so tight knit and there's a lot of crossover. And I think that, you know, if you are still friends with people that you went to your psychedelic facilitating training course with, that you think would be eligible to participate in the study, because it's not only about their experiences and their trainings in the past, but it's about what they're doing now with what they've learned. And I think, yeah, it's going to be I'm really excited for recruitment to be over, just so we can kind of sit down with everything we've learned.
Hmm.
And so I thought, so I don't have to keep doing podcasts like this. That would be great. Um, but I do think, yeah, the survey will be able to offer a lot of insights to both the clinical research field as well as the underground, seeing what everyone's peers are doing.
Right. Yeah. And it endlessly important. I really appreciate y'all doing this one, and it's going to inform above ground and underground practice substantially, in my opinion. And this is only the first study. I hope there's 20 more after this one, because there's so much data to uncover here.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty hefty survey. So it takes approximately 30 minutes from the start to the end and does go into some nitty-gritty details about not only what therapists are and facilitators are doing, but their valuing of different elements of the psychedelic facilitation experience for what their
Hmm.
patients slash clients um, go through. And so, with all that information, we can only put so much in our first paper. So, I think that the intention is to use the findings and explore the different routes that they open up, um, ideally,
Mm.
in additional papers and maybe additional studies.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. I think it's a really big deal. So, can you give your email here in the video just so people listening live can grab it?
Yes, I can. So, my email is so it's actually not my last name, which is why it's a little bit confusing. Um, but so it's HBARNET1, and then it's at ic.ac.uk.
Perfect. And again, everybody will have links in wherever you're watching, and we're going to try to drop it in the comments, a link to the survey itself too. And please distribute this widely with among all people you think might be good candidates. This is really helpful for everybody here. Helps us push back on law enforcement and much more. You know, so please, please, please participate if you can.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, this was great. I'm really happy to be able to have an opportunity to talk to you about it. And yeah, it's really important to spread the word in all means necessary. So really appreciate your support.
Absolutely, Hannah. Thanks for joining us, and I hope we can do more in the future.
Yeah, of course. Hope to see you again.
Thanks.